Oh, this is a special treat for me, it really is, to be talking about N.C. Hunter in a theatre. It couldn't be better. And wasn't that production marvellous? Wasn't it? It was absolutely faultless, I thought. I mean, it was so nuanced and balanced, and the acting, I thought, was superlative. I so enjoyed my afternoon. Norman Hunter was the first playwright, major or otherwise, who I worked with. And I've always loved the compassion, understanding, wisdom, and gentle humour of his plays, and their exact social commentary. But I did not expect to see them revived during my lifetime. In Britain, Hunter's name still exemplifies the slightly bloodless but elegantly written, well-made drawing room drama of the 1950s. Sumptuously mounted and starrily cast, which the English stage company at the Royal Court happily swept away with contempt. So when Jessie Marchese first told me that the Mint Theatre Company was to revive A Day by the Sea, and had already successfully revived A Picture of Autumn, my first reaction was one of astonishment. But on reflection, I was not so surprised. Norman Hunter was an odd duck. He was at ease at London first night parties and literary dinners, but he was not part of that world. He lived in remote mid-Wales with his adored Belgian wife Germaine in a farmhouse which, for most of his successful career, was without electricity or hot water, and in the evening he wrote by the light of an oil lamp. He writes a pure, literate English which sounds true and unaffected wherever the English language is spoken. Uninfluenced by fashion, he seldom uses modish jargon or slang, so his prose has dated far less than that of most of his contemporaries. And he writes marvellous parts for the middle-aged and for the old. Until this beautiful revival, A Day by the Sea has been remembered, in Britain at any rate, for two of the wrong reasons. The first was that its production was used by some disgruntled London producers to break the monopoly and bring down the all-powerful theatrical management of H.M. Tennant and its brilliant but slippery managing director, Hugh Beaumont, known as Binky, by exposing his cunning circumvention of entertainment tax. The second was that the recently knighted Sir John Gielgud, who both played Julian Anson and directed the play, was arrested during rehearsals for cottaging, which is English gay slang for importuning a man in a public convenience, which led to the play being nicknamed in some quarters A Day by the W.C. But it was not really a joke. Homosexuality was then illegal in Britain, and Gielgud could have gone to prison. Entertainment tax was the bane of all theatrical managements. Brought in during the First World War, it was a tax levied on the sale of every theatre ticket. There was, however, a way to avoid paying this tax. If you could prove that your producing company was educational and non-profit making. In other words, that all profits were put back into the company. Binky Beaumont cleverly operated two companies, H.M. Tennant Limited, a profit-making one, and Tennant Productions, non-profit-making. He played one off against the other in what many jealous rivals saw as no more than a tax avoidance scam. He took risks, and one of them was to present A Day by the Sea with his non-profit-making charitable company, Tennant Productions. This the opposition pounced on. When asked how a production at the Theatre Royal Haymarket, with 3 actor nights, a dame, and a big Anglo-American star, could be called purely educational, Binkie replied that seeing Dame Sybil Thorndike act is an education in itself. Although, let me say, that some of the profits that he made from A Day by the Sea were used to mount a production of John Whiting's considerable but very uncommercial play Marching Song. There was, however, much unpleasantness. Binkie's rivals commandeered a member of Parliament to bring in a bill forbidding directors of profit-making from being directors of non-profit-making companies as well. Binkie bribed other members of Parliament with delicious lunches and free seats at his productions to oppose it. And finally, in 1960, 6 years after A Day by the Sea had closed, the whole thing collapsed. Binkie still operated his 2 companies, and entertainment tax was withdrawn, all thanks to A Day by the Sea. After his arrest, Sir John Gielgud thought that his distinguished career had ended. He was blackballed from the Garrick Club, yes, by some members of his own profession, and there was ugly publicity. In the Sunday Express, the columnist John Gordon called for him to be stripped of his knighthood, and the other members of A Day by the Sea cast received letters wondering how they could work with this pervert. On the first night in London, Gielgud was too nervous to make his entrance. Dame Sybil walked over to the stage house, but before she said, "Surely, dear, our miserable little household affairs don't warrant all this portentous discussion," she said quietly to Gielgud, "John, let me take you on. They won't dare boo me." What happened then was that he received such an entrance round, which seemed to go on forever, and that after the performance, a crowd of more than 300 people cheered him from the stage door to his car. It became plain to some of the editors in Fleet Street that public opinion was not what they thought it was. Furthermore, after clearing this hurdle, being outed, Gielgud, always the great actor, became a wondrous one. It was really the establishment of the National Theatre and the Royal Shakespeare Company in the early 1960s which brought about the decline in the power of Binkie, Tennant's, and the primacy of the West End commercial theatre. But at the end of the war, in 1945, Binkie had 12 productions in the West End of London, to say nothing of the numerous tours, repertory companies and concert parties working under the Tennant aegis. "And to think," said Binkie, "that I owe it all to Hitler." He owed it all to Hitler because out of the war came theatre subsidy. CEMA, CEMA, the Wartime Council for the Encouragement of Music and the Arts, which had been used by Binkie to fund many of his wartime and post-war enterprises, became the Arts Council and provided a degree of government-subsidised theatre, although nothing like the degree of subsidy enjoyed by the German and the French theatre. Britain has since sat, rather uneasily, between the 2 stools of American commercial theatre and European subsidised. After the war, too, there was a socialist government which introduced the welfare state. Local education authorities provided grants for further education to those from families who before could never have dreamt of going to college. Thus there was a new generation of educated, articulate, lower middle and working class young people, and by the mid-1950s, some of these were becoming a new theatre audience, and more important, a new type of actor. Neither wanted to watch rich ladies and gentlemen sitting in drawing rooms, in manor house gardens or on beaches. Yet, in 1953, we are 3 years away from the apparent annus mirabilis of 1956, when someone living in the provinces could come to London for a Wednesday night and see, let us say, a matinee of Waiting for Godot, an evening performance of the Berliner Ensemble in Mother Courage, and a matinee next day of Look Back in Anger, an experience that my drama school principal, Nat Brenner, claimed had changed him forever. The 40s and the 50s were the time of Broadway. Nothing in London, apart perhaps from Terence Rattigan's The Deep Blue Sea, quite matched the plays of Arthur Miller and Tennessee Williams. There were the big American musicals too, often brought to London, to Drury Lane or the Coliseum by Binkie. And in London there was no acting school seemingly so revolutionary and certainly so influential as the Actors' Studio. British intellectuals looked enviously across the Atlantic and across the Channel to Girardot, Sartre and Arnouilh, and Brecht, while British actors were in awe of their American counterparts' moment-by-moment emotional truth, although criticising their inability to cope with heightened language or shape long speeches. So what was to be found in the West End of London in the early 1950s? There were the light comedies and thrillers. Don't forget that Agatha Christie is the most successful and prolific female dramatist of all time. There were the verse plays of T.S. Eliot and Christopher Fry. Apart from the cocktail party, the family reunion, and perhaps The Ladies Not for Burning, this seems a very over-decorated genre to us now and is not much in our consciousness. The American musical, one of the greatest of all theatrical forms, whose songs were part of the bloodstream of every child who, like myself, grew up in the 1950s, and whose dancing could seemingly not be emulated by British dancers until quite recently. When A Day by the Sea closed in 1954, two charming English chamber musicals, Salad Days and The Boyfriend, had already opened at the Bristol Old Vic and the Players Theatre respectively, and were to transfer into long West End runs. Then there were what were known as the straight plays, plays without music, whose main purpose was to get the audience to think and feel rather than to scream with laughter. These plays, and indeed all the theatre, was subject to something which, lucky you, have never had in the American theatre: theatrical censorship. And the censor, to whom all play scripts had to be submitted before production, had, since the 1730s, been the Lord Chamberlain, the head of the royal household, who was usually a gentleman who knew damn all about the theatre. He employed readers who were often people who had not been very successful in their pursuit of a theatrical career. In earlier times, the censor's great fear had been either religion or subversive politics. Theatres can be great places of sedition, as we know. But by the 1950s, the absolute preoccupation of Lord Scarborough and later Lord Cobbold was sex, and how any mention of it could corrupt public morals. The Lord Chamberlain was to be a great bane of the new Royal Court playwrights. "She's as rough as a night in a Bombay brothel," runs a line in John Osborne's Look Back in Anger. "Ha, ha, ha, ha," said the Lord Chamberlain's reader. "I must remember to tell that one at the club, but it would never do in the theatre, of course, where people don't know one another." The writers of these straight plays who I'd like to bring to your attention were not the great pre-war successes now in decline, like Noel Coward or Emlyn Williams, and not the great Terence Rattigan, happily now having an almost breathtakingly successful revival in Britain, but the three playwrights who interest me most, who are my music: Wynyard Brown, Rodney Ackland, and our boy, N.C. Hunter, Norman to all of us by now. These three, different in their styles, had two great things in common. They all write about a specific social order, and they all worshipped Anton Chekhov. Norman, to his embarrassment, was known as the English Chekhov. He was embarrassed because nobody for him could approach the wonder of the master. Also, although A Picture of Autumn has some, only Waters of the Moon and A Day by the Sea have loud Chekhovian echoes. In his later plays, A Touch of the Sun, The Excursion and The Tulip Tree, he rather moved out of Chekhov's orbit, and although certain people at the Mint may hit me on the head for saying this, I think he only reached fulfillment when he had had the confidence to do so. Wynyard Brown and Rodney Ackland had had Chekhov revealed to them in the mid-1920s through Theodor Komisarjevsky's famous seasons at the Suburban Barnes Theatre, with actors such as Gielgud, Charles Lawton and Valerie Taylor. Norman had had his road to Damascus during his war service with the Royal Artillery, for in his backpack, wherever he went, he carried the complete works of Anton Chekhov. I think Chekhov, a sharp and ironic man, judges but always gives his characters the benefit of the doubt. Norman, gentler, judges too, but lets his characters off very lightly indeed. The only character he treats harshly is the Canadian heiress sister-in-law in A Touch of the Sun. When the director, Frith Banbury, remonstrated, he said, "But I don't like Margaret." "That is no reason to punish her," said Frith. "You're quite right," said Norman. "She has her own point of view. I'll write her again." And he did. The more I consider the moment that N.C. Hunter and others like him were swept out of fashion by the new guard, the more I believe it was not really the content of their plays that was objected to. After all, Osmond's characters are largely middle class, but the form. Playwrights were fed up with the well-made play. It had held sway for a century, and its form needed bursting apart for the theatre to find new freedoms and different ways. Now, because of the world in which we live, we have a great hankering for form and structure and the skill required in creating these. We want order and balance and a bit of gentleness. When Sybil Thorndike was asked why she and her husband, Sir Lewis Casson, were going to do A Day by the Sea, she said, "Because we love the play. It's very delicate, very funny, and so moving." And when I asked my friend Marjorie Sisley why she had so loved working with Norman Hunter through the genesis of two of his plays, Waters of the Moon and A Touch of the Sun, she just said, "He wrote plays that actors liked to speak." Thank you.